Hello. Our story begins with victory and disappointment. The Siege of Ryloth was a triumph for the Galactic Republic. Their three-stage assault with Generals Skywalker, Windu, and Kenobi led to freedom across the surface of the planet. Wat Tambor was captured and heading back to Coruscant. Windu and Kenobi were awaiting their next deployment commands, and Anakin was facing a different type of struggle inside the bridge of Admiral Yularen's Resolute. During the first stage of the siege, Ahsoka Tano was tasked with leading the attack force against the Separatists in space. She was ordered to retreat when Separatist Captain Mar Tuck revealed the reinforcements he had at his disposal when he trapped Ahsoka and her fighter squadron. Instead of listening to Yularen's demands, she persisted until the flak became too much for her squadron. With that fighter unit being the only starships deployed, the Venators were weak to bomber strikes. In the process of Ahsoka's flee from the Separatist surprise attack, she lost herself an entire squadron of clone pilots, an entire Venator, extreme damage to the other one, and of course, nearly killing Admiral Yularen in the same go. That accounted for a casualty total higher than 7,400 men. Those troopers could not be replaced, and throughout the ground side of the invasion of Ryloth, Admiral Yularen considered those losses. There was a scenario where he could have deployed the fighter fleet during that battle, but they would have lost more men and likely the entire Venator fleet too, disrupting the entire invasion. While Anakin and Ahsoka had their own issues on the surface of the Twi'lek home world, Yularen came to a conclusion inside of his own head while commanding the bombing runs on Separatist forces. Perhaps it was from looking death directly in the eyes, but a message needed to be sent to not just the Jedi Order but the Republic. He may have disliked working with Skywalker, when there were far less adventurous Jedi in the galaxy, but this duo of master and apprentice almost cost him his life. War wasn't a joke, and trusting a 14-year-old Padawan with leadership responsibilities wasn't something he was willing to allow again. He made a note to himself, before deciding to go forward with this, that he wouldn't request for Ahsoka's imprisonment. She was, after all, a child. However, the Jedi needed to be made aware of their mistakes, and how they would cost the Republic this war if they continued to make senseless failures. That's exactly how he phrased it when he told Anakin upon his return from the surface. This galactic civil war, despite being titled the Clone War, wasn't a joke. The entire fabric of the civilized galaxy hung in the balance. Trusting 14-year-old children with that wasn't something Yularen would willingly participate in. He directly stated that if he had the option to step down, then he would take it, but the Republic mattered to him. He needed it as much as they needed him. Ahsoka was the odd one out, and Skywalker would bear the responsibility of watching over this court-martial. There was nothing he could do. Sure, Anakin outranked Admiral Yularen by a technicality, but since the Republic Admiral was bringing up this case, it had to go to trial. And while he would prefer a court setting, this was a frontline court-martial. They didn't have time or resources to be sending to and from Coruscant, so inside the damaged Resolute, a vessel that wouldn't have such external damages if orders had been followed, they would hold their court case. Since Masters Kenobi and Windu were still around Ryloth, they were included, but only as a part of the audience. The jury consisted of Cham Syndulla, the other Republic captains in the fleet with no affiliation to the Jedi, and clones that didn't personally know Ahsoka, including Commander Pons. As all juries, they had to have no biases, and that's what Ahsoka would get. Truth be told, she was very caught off guard from this. She really didn't know how to feel about it. There was no time to process anything because she was resting when Anakin knocked on her door and informed her of the court case. Master Skywalker tried to convince Yularen not to do this, but the still wounded Republic Admiral couldn't stop seeing the Vulture droids slamming into the bridge. He reminded Skywalker before he went to wake up Ahsoka that if that glass broke, all of them would be dead. His apprentice would be too. This wasn't a case of forgive and forget. This was a let the jury decide and face the punishment. Anakin sat with his hands in death grips as Windu and Kenobi flanked him from either side. Behind them, Rex and a few of the other men of the 501st watched. None of the men from the unit were mad at Ahsoka. They understood that leadership came with mistakes. Sure, there were a few men in the 501st that reasoned with why Yularen was upset, but to the clones, fighting for the Republic had always been a part of their lives. They knew that if they died, that they were dying for the right side. That was echoed by Rex and his brothers behind Obi-Wan, Mace, and Anakin. Yularen started the procedure as if this was a battle debriefing. Due to everything being so immediate following the Battle of Ryloth, no one else present at this action were aware of the first stage of the assault. They knew that Yularen lost 2 Venators, but very quickly the entire battle would be retold from his perspective. It obviously didn't frame Ahsoka in the best light, but it was also a very accurate retelling of the battle. It covered the Disobeyed Orders, the destruction of the entire Venator, costing the lives of 7,400 crewmen on board. He mentioned the external damages to the other 2 Venators and cited the destruction of the second vessel for victory. To Yularen's credit, he at least attributed some of the victory to Ahsoka's quick learning. She did a fine job at returning to Ryloth and leading a successful counterattack, one that helped them secure the planet. More so though, Yularen made a point that this procedure might save thousands of lives in future battles. The Jedi were growing reckless by allowing their students to command large swaths of clones, and it was forcing the Republic to choke away battles that didn't need to be lost. If anything, Yularen was making a case that forbade Jedi Padawans from holding leadership inside the Grand Army unless the situation became so dire that they had to take command. And while one could make the argument that the clones were younger, their accelerated training and battle-focused upbringing made them far more capable combatants than the Jedi were at the same age. To that end though, Yularen allowed the neutral stand-in judge, who was another Republic officer with the invasion force, to allow Ahsoka to defend herself. This was absolutely a kangaroo court in many ways. The Jedi Padawan would call upon Rex and other clones to defend her, which they would, but her master was not permitted to do so. The seemingly neutral affiliation of this court wasn't really that neutral. Yularen played his cards just right because he wanted one outcome. He was very clear that he didn't want Ahsoka to face imprisonment, he just wanted her removed from the army. No Jedi Padawan belonged in their ranks, it was too dangerous for everyone involved. Being that Yularen brought together a jury of Republic officers more than clones, the Jedi knew that this case wouldn't go in Ahsoka's favor. Was this petty revenge? Was it Yularen genuinely trying to protect others from unnecessary deaths? A little bit of both? Was it Yularen suffering from his less than 72-hour-old head injury? No one really knew, but it was clear, even through his brow, that he wanted Ahsoka out of his command ship and away from his unit. She was unsafe. Unfortunately for Ahsoka, after all the evidence of the battle and the testimonies and so forth, she would be convicted of failing to obey direct orders. Her punishment was the immediate return to Coruscant and being barred from serving the Republic military until she was over the age of 18 and a Jedi Knight. This was final. There'd be no changing it. An official document and recording of this action would be sent to the Grand Military Complex on Coruscant so that the Republic could review the case and then act on it. Jedi younglings and Padawans should no longer hold officer positions inside the Grand Army of the Republic. In a funny way, the court proceedings just ended. Ahsoka wasn't arrested, she wasn't taken away. Nothing actually happened to her. She just lost all of her ranking and would be removed from the army when the time was right. She was of course distraught. She formed genuine connections with the men of the 501st. They were her brothers. She didn't want to leave them behind, but Ahsoka also had to turn her worries to how she'd be trained. If she couldn't participate in military exercises with the 501st, then what would Anakin do about her instruction? Would he remain her teacher, or would she be passed on to a monk that lived entirely inside the Jedi Temple? While Obi-Wan and Mace Windu tried to console her and figure out the best solution to this problem, Anakin was missing. To clarify, the Jedi didn't want Anakin away from the front lines. He was far too valuable to the war effort. In the end though, it was his decision if he would step away from the war to train Ahsoka. Regardless of that pending decision, Skywalker cornered Yularen in one of the Resolute's corridors, just outside the location of the makeshift court hearing. He told Yularen that he was scum for putting Ahsoka through that. He even threatened the Republic Admiral, telling him that if he ever put his student into danger again, he'd personally hurt the officer. Yularen, despite nursing his head wound, did not back down from his Jedi General. He squared up with his younger comrade and asked if it angered Skywalker as much that he put Ahsoka's life into danger every time they deployed out of hyperspace. If anything, Anakin should be grateful that Yularen saved her from potentially getting herself killed or getting any more people killed. he should be using the words thank and you. Yularen squeezed away from Anakin and continued down the corridor, before stopping in the medical bay to check on his head again. Skywalker just watched helplessly as Yularen forcibly removed his student from the 501st, and then jabbed another dagger into his chest. He was furious. He wanted to stand by the words he'd just said, but it was perhaps more telling of Yularen's intentions that he didn't immediately rat on Anakin's threat. It was entirely possible that Yularen was doing this for the betterment of his men, rather than petty revenge. Anakin leaned against the wall and banged the bottom of his palm against the wall. He was so frustrated, because to a certain extent, Yularen wasn't even wrong. Ahsoka made a mistake. Actions do indeed have consequences. 7,400 men were dead because of them. Anakin believed that maybe a court-martial was too far, but at the same time, the liberation of Ryloth almost failed. Yet, to that same argument, it wouldn't have succeeded without Ahsoka. It was a double-edged sword. Both parties were entirely correct with their stances, but only one side came out on top. She was no longer a member of the 501st. Rex spoke with Ahsoka after the other two Jedi separated from her. She was okay, but reasonably sad. She made great connections with her brothers and didn't want to leave them, though she understood that she made her mistakes and accepted them without putting the blame on anyone else but herself. Aside from the actual punishment, she really just dwelled on what Mace and Obi-Wan said to her. They explained that they wanted Ahsoka to continue training with Anakin, regardless of whatever he chose for himself. Mace didn't want to reassign Ahsoka to another Jedi. This wasn't necessarily an attachment-based decision, it was just difficult on students that had to transfer between masters, especially if the instructor died. The heartbreak of being removed from her unit would force Ahsoka to struggle with any other Jedi Master, because she had a lot of work ahead of her in that situation. But Mace was very assertive during that conversation, even until Anakin joined in, that he and Ahsoka would remain as master and apprentice unless Skywalker decided otherwise. This was backed up in a different conversation with the three Jedi Masters. Anakin basically just got an idea of what Mace was saying. Obi-Wan then asked what Anakin wanted to do about his position. If he remained with the 501st, he'd have to instruct Ahsoka from a distance if he remained her instructor. If not, Anakin would be removed from the unit like Ahsoka, and another Jedi would be assigned. This put Skywalker into a difficult position, because he definitely didn't want his men getting stuck with an inefficient Jedi General. Yet he trusted Rex, and instead asked if they could promote him to Commander. Mace and Obi-Wan looked to each other and didn't see why it couldn't be suggested to Republic High Command. Anakin just expressed that he had no doubt in his mind that he would return to Coruscant with Ahsoka, rather than make her find another teacher. He just had to make sure on the other side of it that his men were still taken care of. Returning to the temple was bittersweet for Anakin and Ahsoka. Neither of them were happy about the circumstances, but Anakin was at least overjoyed that he stayed with Ahsoka rather than the unit. Before they landed at the temple, they received news from Master Windu that Captain Rex was being promoted to the rank of Marshal Commander. The 501st wasn't in need of any Jedi leadership, so they'd be fine on their own. Instead of immediately going into training with Ahsoka, Anakin took some time to himself to reflect. Ever since the court-martial, he considered if he put Ahsoka into position to fail. He knew that she was broken up about being forced away from the front lines. Maybe he was part of the problem too. As he reflected, going into the first night following his return from Ryloth, he recognized that he did hurt Ahsoka too. The blame wasn't totally on her, even though she was the one that made the mistake at Ryloth. Anakin just tried to imagine fighting in the Clone War at the age of 14. That was almost unthinkable, and surely he would have made similar miscalculations as she had, especially since he was even more rebellious to Obi-Wan's commands. This isn't to say he was taking responsibility for Ahsoka's actions over Ryloth, rather that he understood that war was not a place for Padawans. He didn't agree with Admiral Yularen's methods, and definitely lost a lot of respect for him because of his actions, but to an extent, the motivations seemingly weren't wrong. Any number of Jedi commanders, most of which being young Padawans, weren't equipped for war. They weren't prepared for conflict like the clones were. It then turned Anakin's attention to how he could prepare Ahsoka for battle, but also something else. His reflection made him think about something regarding the war and how it should be done. Yet he didn't have an answer for that yet, and maybe he never would. But something that was especially true was that this situation changed his perspective on the Clone War. For now, instead of adventure, great conquest, and being a war hero, he would train a student and spend time with his wife. That was a good trade in his opinion for now. Instructing Ahsoka on Coruscant wasn't the most thrilling life ever. In the few months following Ryloth, she developed, but not like how she did while they were on the front lines. It's not that anything changed with Skywalker's training regiment, it's just a fact that war forced individuals to adapt. If one couldn't adapt in war, then they could very easily die. It was life and death. Anakin and Rex kept up constant communication throughout this time. The 501st was still succeeding, and that's really all that mattered. Skywalker, though, had his own developments while being on Coruscant for a few months. Thanks to all the time he was spending with his wife, and really dwelling on his own actions, for allowing Ahsoka to serve in command during the Clone War as a 14-year-old, he realized that maybe the ethics of the conflict should be considered. By this point, Padawans were completely removed from leadership roles within the Grand Army. It was proper legislation and everything. It made the Jedi look terrible. But Anakin was concerned with a much different array of ethics, that of the position of the Jedi Order. Being around Padme was intoxicating in all the best ways. She brought out the best in him. He never really expected it to be the case, and it made him happy. It was just nice existing around someone who loved him for him. They coexisted without suffering through months of deployment like they shared at the beginning of the war. But this great amount of time also came with belief-based conversations. She would never turn him against Palpatine intentionally, but she did help him raise questions about the ethics of war. The Jedi were peacekeepers, knights of the Republic. Their duty was to maintain peace, and they were doing the opposite. On the other side of the court-martial, he could see that Yularen was mostly right, but it led to Anakin sitting in individual sessions with Mace Windu, Yoda, Jocasta Nu, Sindralik, and other elders of the Jedi Order. He wasn't a pacifist by any means. He knew himself better than to just pretend like he wasn't the slaughterer of Tusken Raiders. But the conundrum was that if Dooku was a known Sith, then why were they allowing the war to persist? This was a case that someone like Windu agreed with, just to a varying degree. The Jedi Council couldn't just put out a hit on Count Dooku themselves. He was a political leader in the eyes of the Confederacy. The concept of Sith didn't mean anything to anyone anymore. So if they just jumped him inside of his castle, he would be the victim, even in the eyes of the Republic most likely. Anakin also asked about peace treaty options, and someone like Yoda would explain that the Jedi didn't have representation within the Senate, to which Jocasta Nu in a different conversation explained why the Jedi Order never joined the Galactic Republic. Everything was extremely eye-opening for young Skywalker. He still developed exceptionally with the lightsaber as he grew closer with the older masters of the Order, but he also learned more about the Jedi and their place in the galaxy. It made for a unique sparring experience for the likes of someone like Mace Windu, but then all of this openness flipped on his head when he decided to approach the body of the High Council about a proposition. If the Jedi couldn't act on behalf of the Republic, then why not go into Separatist territory and request for one of them to bring forward a peace treaty on behalf of the galaxy? Unfortunately for Anakin, the High Council wasn't biting it. There were too many variables to consider. They really suggested that he focus on Ahsoka's training and continue to fill his mind with information. Despite deciding that going into enemy lines to bring a peace treaty back to the Republic was a bad idea, the High Council had grown a deep admiration for Anakin since Ryloth. He'd grown more calm, understanding, and inquisitive. He had questions, very useful ones, and they were always willing to answer them. The tragedy is, though, the Council liked his idea, but there was no guarantee of a Separatist representative supporting their cause. And because the Jedi were already deep in with the Republic already for the whole Padawan situation, they couldn't really risk another PR nightmare. This was a very valid reason, even to Anakin. It would be counterproductive to just throw themselves at a random Separatist system and hope that their representative would agree with them, and then go to the Confederacy and bring forth a peace treaty. It's not like the Confederacy was especially pro-Jedi after the Order decided to side with the Republic. So Anakin was dismissed, but praised for thinking outside the box. There weren't any other masters stationed inside the temple thinking about ending the war. That was an achievement that he should be proud of. Maybe he was a little hyperactive, but that energy was being poured into something productive and helpful. They genuinely all encouraged that Anakin continue down that path because he might end up finding a way to resolve the war. He would be disappointed by this outcome, but he was married to someone with perhaps a more risky mindset. At dinner, following the council discussion, he told his wife about the session. Padme didn't even finish her meal. Quickly, she told him to get his apprentice and sent 3PO to get her starship. They were gonna go to Anderon. Padme's friendship with a senator who mentored her when she first joined the Senate was her solution. Mina Bonteri of Anderon was a peace-loving representative who joined the CIS because the Republic's corruption was too difficult to manage. The roots were crumbling, and the best option for her people was to join the Confederacy. The two Jedi accompanied an eager Padme Amidala to the planet so that they could discuss the potential of a CIS treaty with the Republic. Mina wasn't especially optimistic, but because this was still within the first year of the war, she figured that it'd be worth her time. There were some other specific notions of what kind of deals should be made inside the treaty, and how it would look if it was sent to the Republic. But more than anything, this wasn't a surrender from the Separatists, which Padme made very clear during their discussion. This was bringing the concept of a ceasefire to the public so that the war could be brought to a conclusion. Anakin was extremely anxious about this. He trusted Mina because of Padme, but if anyone learned that the Jedi were on Anderon, he would be in huge trouble. Despite his concerns, Mina provided the three of them cloaks so that they could sit in on the session with the Separatist Senate. It was both so that Mina could humanize their parliament to a Jedi Knight, but also so that they would know that she tried her best. Surprisingly, even to Dooku's chagrin, the Separatist government voted in favor of ending the Clone War. They didn't want conflict to begin with, and an official peace treaty would be sent to the Republic capital world. Once they returned to Mina's home, she wished them safe passage back to Coruscant, knowing that they'd be leaving with proof of peace on the way. But Anakin wasn't exactly ready to leave. He spoke with Padme following the session about the chances of Dooku trying to have Mina killed for ending the war. He did after all make a point that Dooku didn't look extremely pleased that the war was going to come to an end. After all, it was Padme who knew that Dooku was trying to end her life before Geonosis. It might as well and very well easily could be the same case here from Mina Bonteri. Anakin opted to stay on Anderon to protect the Separatist senator. Mina was very hesitant over this. She didn't really believe in having Jedi protection, but if Padme could convince her to bring a peace treaty into the Separatist government, then she could convince Bonteri to allow this protection. Ahsoka would also volunteer, much to Anakin's caution. She pleaded and asked to stay, citing that this would also be her first experience outside the temple since Ryloth. That was more than enough to get Anakin to fold. He understood how frustrating it had been for her to be stuck on Coruscant, so their mission with Mina began, and Senator Amidala returned to the capital. The first few days with Mina on Anderon were very uneventful. It allowed Ahsoka and Anakin to train under different circumstances, but nothing really came from it. Once the treaty was sent from Raxus to Coruscant, though, that's when the problems began. Mina was in charge of the peacemaking process. Grievous was going to also detonate the Coruscant power grid, so that the treaty would be rejected in session. As everything started to move into position for the Sith to maintain this war, Count Dooku arrived at Mina's home. She welcomed him in, as Anakin and Ahsoka hid elsewhere inside the home, to watch this discussion. Dooku explained to her very briefly how much he enjoyed working with her, since the foundation of the Confederacy. She was one of his favorite allies inside their government, someone that the CIS desperately needed. With all of that being relevant, he also needed her to rescind her statements. Call it an early war draft that they made up and didn't mean to send. They signed off on it by accident and it was sent to Coruscant by mistake. All she needed to do was make one little speech and they could continue fighting this war. Bonteri displayed visible disgust and concern. Why did he want her to rescind the peace treaty? Is that not what they wanted? Independence? Dooku shook his head. They were going to destroy the Republic. If she wanted to have any part in that, she would forfeit the surrender and return to governing in his government. She directly called him no different than Palpatine, and his lightsaber ignited. Dooku swung forward, and Skywalker from the other side of the foyer leapt out, slashing his saber outwards and blocking the strike. He stumbled, but Ahsoka quickly got Mina out of the way. Her lightsaber ignited and she turned to watch Dooku and her master engage. This was another duel for them. the last since Tatooine, Geonosis before it. Their lightsabers continued to shriek with every twist and jab. Ahsoka pushed herself in, trying to help, but she knew that she was no match for either opponent. Dooku wanted to take her out because he still had very strict orders to not kill Skywalker, so why not break him? Every chance he got, he stabbed towards Ahsoka. Anakin was a good teacher, so she was adequately prepared. But the truth is, neither opponent was a challenge for the aging Count. Mina, on the other hand, made sure every single piece of this engagement was filmed. Thanks to the overhead cameras in the foyer of the home, she'd be able to retain everything from her near assassination to the hopeful Jedi victory. It was a funny predicament for her to be in. She didn't really like the Jedi for siding with the Republic, but now she understood. Anakin backhanded Dooku across their cheek and threw his saber forward. Tyrannus deflected easily, catching Ahsoka and lobbing her over his shoulder with the Force. She slammed into the wall, almost unconscious. It brought Anakin back to Geonosis, when he and his master fought Dooku. Now he had become Obi-Wan, fighting one of the great duelists of their era. Anakin didn't fear Dooku. He continued to strike as if he had decades more experience than his opponent. This thrilled the old man because it made the taste of victory feel all the more satisfying. He could put this no-good pupil of Palpatine in his place, and remind him that a position with the Sith was not given, it was earned. Skywalker and Tyrannus traded blows, with their sabers blasting one another's. Ahsoka, on the other side of the room, rubbed her head. She watched her master continue to push Dooku, until the Sith Lord dropped back, slipping Anakin's strike and countering. By jabbing his saber straight through Skywalker's thigh, he dropped on his knee, and threw his saber in front of his neck, blocking what could have very easily been a decapitation. Dooku had to stop himself, but with one more strike he knocked Anakin backwards. Skywalker planted his saber on the ground to stop himself from falling, and just as Dooku prepared to drive his saber down, Ahsoka, like her master on Geonosis all those months ago, leapt across the room. She miscalculated her defense of her master, but Tyrannus was expecting it. He figured an apprentice would be like her master, and she paid the price for it. She fell to her knees and Anakin watched her fall. He tried to process the sight of his apprentice suffering from this wound. It didn't seem real. He could see Dooku's lightsaber sticking out of her back, and everything went red. In Tyrannus' mind, messing with Skywalker was always a fun idea, but killing his student just felt like more good fun, until he saw the switch in his opponent's eyes. Unfortunately for Tyrannus the Arrogant, he was too busy lavishing in his victory over a 15-year-old Jedi Padawan to defend himself from the 20-year-old psychotic murderer of a Tusken village. It cost him his life immediately. Anakin bashed his saber across Dooku's face, and he fell down, before Anakin wrung his neck from the top of his hilt to the tip of his saber. When he acknowledged Dooku's death, he quickly rushed to Ahsoka's side. He grabbed his apprentice and held her in his arms. She was faint already, so much more fragile than he could have ever imagined. Anakin promised Ahsoka that he'd save her, that they would fix this. He choked back tears with each passing second, knowing that he had to be the strong one for a student. She deserved the best from him. He wasn't panicking, and she was calm. Ahsoka just held onto his hand and tried to find any words to say, eventually landing on something that felt true because it came from her dying heart. Ahsoka told her master that she would have done it 100 times and again to end this war. It was followed with rough coughing, a weak smile, but one that wore satisfaction. Anakin told his apprentice that she was the greatest student an instructor could ever wish for. He would make this right. He would get her out of this. Her smile was still very present, but she shook her head. Ahsoka patted her master's hand and nodded her way back into an eternal rest. Mina rushed out when she felt that the duel was over. She didn't see Ahsoka's death, and all she saw was a Jedi Master holding an apprentice he loved like a sister. When he felt her soul transcend into the living force, the tears he had been choking back slipped out, and he said goodbye to his apprentice for one last time. Ahsoka's sacrifice would not be in vain. The Coruscant power grid would, yes, be bombed, but just moments after the grid was bombed, Mina Bontiri, assuming command over the Confederacy, dispatched a transmission to Coruscant. In it, she displayed Count Dooku's merciless attack on herself and the Jedi Padawan, Ahsoka Tano. She also cited the bravery of Master Jedi Anakin Skywalker for saving her life and sacrificing it all to end the Clone War. She called this a chance to bridge the galaxy together and weed out those who wished to prolong the conflict. It'd be the speech of the millennium. Mina, while using the evidence to prove her point, almost single-handedly ended the Clone War. As it turns out, putting out mainstream evidence of a 15-year-old child being murdered by an 80-year-old warmonger isn't widely loved. While there'd be pushback inside the Senate from Palpatine to keep the war going, it would overwhelmingly fall out of popularity. This was not the individual senators making this decision. If it were, the war would have continued. Instead, every single Republic planet, with a few exceptions inside the core, demanded that their representation end the conflict. It clearly wasn't real, and the culprits behind it needed to be found and executed. This resulted in Palpatine losing his emergency powers over the Senate, but he was not seen as a direct threat to the government. He still had a few options as a result of this as well. With Grievous and Ventress still under his command, he tried to rebelliously start the Clone War again. The Separatist Parliament turned against the war effort, so it had to come from somewhere. Palpatine's options were keep the war going, execute Order 66 and bail out, or try to politically keep things in his favor and build the Empire from the ashes of war. He went for options 1 and 3. Sidious trusted his political intuition far too much, and he was so close as it was to winning. If he executed Order 66, the Jedi could be wiped out. Hell, he could destroy the Senate and local leadership with other orders, but he still didn't have total control over the droid armies, which remained his problem. The clones would never win a legitimate war against the droid army, so he played it out. He tested his political skills and maneuvered through the post-war era with an effort to restart it. To his great disappointment, that would never be the case. Anakin received the honorary rank of Master, as the Jedi believed his apprentice's selfless sacrifice was a depiction of his instruction as a Jedi. They saw Anakin's pain and rewarded him for doing everything the Jedi needed to be during the war. He was all of them in that moment. His decision to disobey their orders may have costed Ahsoka her life, but she did it with honor, as a Jedi Knight would, as a protector of peace. Darth Sidious's attempts to divide the galaxy fell in vain. 10 years after the death of Ahsoka, the Republic, the Confederate States, and the Neutral Coalition were at peace. Chancellor Palpatine was 9 years removed from office, and total conflict in the galaxy 8 years gone. General Grievous's rebellion, prompted by Sidious, was effective. But thanks to the Bontiri Doctrine, the Confederacy was able to capture battle droids and turn them against Grievous. The rebellion was put down, and peace resumed with skirmishes from devout Dooku loyalists. They were who remained in action and in conflict for the majority of the 2 years that followed the end of the Clone War. Palpatine nearly returned to maintaining his emergency powers, but the Republic voted between emergency powers or a Speaker of the Rotunda position. They chose the latter, resulting in the nullification of the Chancellor role. The Speaker position didn't have any power. They mostly just maintained order through debates. Eventually, though, Palpatine grew tired of this role and abandoned the Senate, without his power and without Order 66. Because Anakin spent so much time on Coruscant, picking the heads of the Masters around the temple before Ahsoka's death, he returned with wild ideas following everything on Anderon. Suggestions for the removal of the Jedi from active combat, so that they could be the unifying factor in the galaxy. The Council took this to heart. Following Ahsoka's death, the Jedi Order removed itself from the entire war effort to focus on missions akin to Anakin's, which not only saved Mina Bontiri's life, but saved the lives of various other senators the Sith targeted. This is also why Order 66 could not be acted on. Now though, Jedi Master Anakin Skywalker, member of the High Council and Master of the Order, beside Grandmaster Windu, felt a disturbance in the Force. The Sith had been apparently disposed of. He trained another Padawan since Ahsoka's death, and requested for a statue of his former apprentice to be built on the steps of the temple. It was, after all, Ahsoka who now greeted every visitor to the Jedi structure. Regardless, Anakin's life played out with marriage, family, and love, following the end of the Clone War. His twins, Luke and Ashla, were both 7 years old by this point. They went to school with the last name Naberi, and understood why their father's job wasn't talked about. Ashla was a nickname of Ahsoka's in her home village. Padme thought it'd be a beautiful way to remember someone so important to her husband. Anakin's disturbance revolved around his children. Even if the Jedi weren't permitted to have relationships, a few people knew about the twins: Obi-Wan, Plo Koon, and a few of the men from the 501st. Rex and a couple of those clones always kept an eye on Luke and Ashla, like a protective service, because despite the Jedi giving up their hunt for the Sith, Anakin still believed they existed. At this point in his career as a Jedi, nothing really slipped past him. He was assertively aware of everything. The trauma of losing a student after Yularen tried to save her forced him to work harder than ever to be the best Jedi for the Order. That's why he was Master of the Order, because he was looking out for every Jedi, trying to make sure none of them suffered the same fate as Ahsoka. His disturbances were proven validated by a mysterious figure who seemed to track the twins when they went to school. The black-robed individual was exactly what Rex and the other clones were hired to keep an eye out for. Think of it like Secret Service. The reason the boys were with him was because Mina wanted to give back to Anakin after everything he did, and all he asked her to do was give back to the clones. This was one of the ways of giving back to them and keeping them close. A week into spotting this figure on the daily, Anakin started to follow his children to school at a distance. Luke and Ashla did sports, but that was out of season, so they usually went to school, came home, and played in the apartment complex or at the Senate building with their mother. Skywalker made sure that they could have indefinite freedom. He traced the shadowy figure after they were dropped off at school in the morning by 3PO. Once the individual reached his transport, Anakin, slowly, with all of his concentration, closed the ship in on Palpatine. There was no explosion, because Anakin contained it with pure focus. Sidious tried to protect himself, but who should have become his pupil was far too powerful for him. Master Skywalker was 30. He was unbeatable, even for the Sith Lord. Palpatine would die within moments of the ship crumbling in on him. The wreckage would reveal the stalker being that of Sheev Palpatine. The remnants of a lightsaber remained behind, that of a Sith. It was enough evidence for Skywalker to bring back to the Council to confirm the destruction of the Sith, and the true confirmation that he was indeed the Chosen One. Anakin eliminated Palpatine with the flex of his hands, and never revealed that his children were the ones being stalked. This was a much different experience that he had than the one with Tyrannus, but it was cause for celebration. Anakin brought flowers to Ahsoka's statue to tell her that her mission was complete. Her life had been honored, the Sith were gone. Anakin always knew that the Sith Lord, the one that remained, would be too tempted to keep an eye on his children, knowing that he was the one that killed Dooku. He just never expected it to be Palpatine. In the end though, because the galactic problems were resolved, this was more of a win for the Jedi. The galaxy saw Dooku with a lightsaber, but the Jedi didn't over-explain it because they wanted to end the conflict. So the Sith were kind of in the mainstream, kinda not. At the end though, Anakin made his amends with Yularen. They never shared a friendship like Skywalker did with his clones, but in some way, he knew it was something Ahsoka would have wanted. He and Padme would have another child following the death of the Sith Lord, and the Jedi also weren't in the need to know. The Nabiri children would grow up to lead the galaxy in different ways, Luke and Ashla taking to the Senate, while the third child, a son named Jason, would accompany Anakin inside the Jedi Order. No one in the Order or the Council would ever know the truth, but Jason Nabiri would be his final student before becoming Grand Master in a galaxy with true balance in the Force. And that, my friends, is our story, and special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash the like button. Sith Clone Wars every Saturday. Super excited. Episode 34 dropped yesterday. It's pretty cool. Getting some more hype. The hype moments were ooper duper real. Anyways, let's talk about this story. Yularen's decision is definitely one I want you guys to be divided on, because he technically does make the right decision. You kind of have to play devil's advocate with him. It'd be like, oh, is he technically right? Is he technically wrong? He's technically right. It does actually lead to Ahsoka dying, and because I'm not Filoni, I didn't create the World Between Worlds just to bring her back, but it does directly lead in her death. Yularen saving her does end the Clone War. It is the better outcome for the galaxy, but it is what kills her, so it's really up to you how you perceive if Yularen was right or wrong. And that's really what I wanted out of the first true segment of this story, was that you're gonna feel kind of mixed feelings about Yularen, because you're like, well, he wouldn't do that, but if his motivations, which are never clearly revealed, are pure, then maybe he would do that. It is what if after all. As for the rest of the story, I liked Anakin making the decision himself to train Ahsoka. I think by that point in the conflict, he had grown close enough to her where he'd be okay with training her on Coruscant and leaving the war effort. Though he is like hyperactive, the dude can't sit still, and that's why I think he would not only spar with someone like Windu, but also ask questions. Him being around Padme would really kind of encourage him to be more aware of what's going on. And I think that's what leads to the Anderon mission much earlier. I'd say probably somewhere between like 5 to 12 months earlier than it happens in canon. And that, I think, is also better for the Republic and better for ending the war, but also it's a better way for Anakin to deal with Dooku. And that's what I wanted Anakin in that situation for, to not only save Mina, but also end the Clone War. And then obviously I wanted to do like a little split end, kind of jump in the time a little bit, which I don't usually do, but it was really fun to kind of jump ahead and then be like, oh, he's just basically a god at this point, and he would be. I don't really think there's anything in the galaxy that would stop him. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.